Belfast does not look like any other Irish city. It did not begin as a monastery, nor as a Norman port, nor as a royal Gaelic capital. It began as a ford in the mud, a place where the tide pulled back twice a day and let you cross the river. A Gaelic name and a geographical question. And on that ford, over 12 centuries were stacked layer after layer of conquest, plantation, industry, civil war and renewal, each one pressing down on the last without ever quite erasing it. Belfast was planted by settlers from another country, built on linen and iron, torn apart by 30 years of urban conflict and rebuilt on the wreckage of that same conflict. It is the city of the Titanic and of the murals, of the shipyards and the barricades, of a piece still being written. This video was made using AI tools to visually reconstruct how Belfast looked across its history. The images are not always perfect, but every fact has been carefully researched. Before Belfast there was a ford. Where the small river Farset ran into the River Lagan, the tide pulled back twice a day over shallow sandbanks and opened a crossing toward the County Down shore. The Gaelic people who lived on those banks called the place the mouth of the Sandbank ford. It was not a poetic name, it was a description of a crossing that mattered. And it was on that crossing, not on a defensible hill or a natural harbour, that one of the most turbulent cities in Europe would eventually rise. The hills around the ford already carried the marks of an older world. 5 kilometres to the south stood a circular earthwork older than the pyramids. Above the bay, on the rocky brow of Cave Hill, an Iron Age fort held the high ground. The region was lived in, travelled and contested, but the ford remained its centre. Around the year 500, the area belonged to a coastal kingdom that spanned the east of Ulster and the west of Scotland, when the Irish Sea was a road rather than a border. Around the year 665, the Irish annals record a battle at the ford between two Gaelic peoples competing for the east of Ulster. It is the first dated mention of the site. Not a foundation, not a building, a fight over a crossing. For the next 5 centuries, the ford stayed what it had always been. A chapel would eventually be built there, serving pilgrims crossing the flats toward the County Down. The fort had its name, it was still waiting for its city. In January 1177, a Norman knight named John de Courcy rode out of Dublin with 22 mounted knights and around 300 foot soldiers. He had no royal permission. He had decided to conquer Ulster on his own initiative. 4 days later, he took the royal capital of East Ulster by surprise. The victory gave him control of the eastern province, and with it, the ford on the Lagan. He is believed to have ordered fortifications built on the ford itself to guard the crossing, probably a simple timber keep on the spot where the main streets of Belfast now meet. But his real stronghold he built on the shore of the Lough, about 10 miles to the north. That is where he ruled. The ford was still only an outpost. De Courcy eventually fell, not to the Irish, but to his fellow Normans. In 1204, a rival lord captured him with royal backing, and the earldom of Ulster passed to another family. The ford changed hands, then the Normans weakened and the Gaelic lords returned. The fortifications on the ford were attacked, abandoned, rebuilt, attacked again. In 1503 and 1512, the Earl of Kildare had the successive structures pulled down as illegal. Belfast was not a town, it was a contested position that no one held for long. The real danger came from the English crown. In 1574, the Earl of Essex tried to tame East Ulster. That October, he invited the local Gaelic chief to a feast at the fortification on the ford and had him arrested with his wife and his brother. They were sent south and executed. It was not conquest. It was betrayal dressed as diplomacy, and it only hardened the Gaelic resistance. That resistance reached its peak in the Long War at the end of the century. For 6 years, the Earl of Tyrone held out against the full military power of the Crown. The garrison on the ford was overrun by the rebels in 1597. The Lagan Valley was devastated, but the rebellion finally collapsed, and by 1603 Ulster was exhausted. It was into this landscape that a quiet, methodical English soldier named Arthur Chichester walked. He had just inherited his brother's lands, and he had much larger plans than anyone expected. If this channel has ever brought a piece of history to life for you, consider joining as a member. It helps fund the research, the production, and the next Reconstruction. The link is in the description. In September 1607, the last great Gaelic lords of Ulster sailed into exile from the northwest coast. They never came back. Their departure left Ulster without its old leadership for the first time in centuries. The King of England saw the opening. In 1609, he launched the most systematic colonisation programme Ireland had ever seen. Chichester had already been granted the ruined castle on the ford and the lands around it. He brought in masons and smiths from England. He had more than 1 million bricks burned. By 1611, a new castle in stone and timber stood on the old site. It was no longer an outpost. It was the centre of a town taking shape. In 1613, Belfast was made a corporation. The population was now mostly English, Scottish, and from the Isle of Man. The Gaelic village at the ford existed only in the name, which no one spoke in Irish anymore. The Plantation reshaped the province. Settlers from the Scottish lowlands came across in numbers, bringing their Presbyterian faith, their farming methods, and a wariness of the crown. Belfast became a town in which 3 communities lived side by side without truly mixing. The English of the established church, the Scottish Presbyterians, and the Irish Catholics pushed out to the edges. Then came the wars. In 1641, the Gaelic Catholics of Ulster rose against the confiscations of the previous generation. Belfast held, protected by its garrison. Refugees poured in from the countryside. A Scottish army occupied the town in 1644, and the parliamentary forces of Cromwell took it from them in 1649. Belfast changed hands, but it stayed standing. The real transformation came from an unexpected direction. In 1685, the King of France revoked the protection of his country's Protestants, and thousands of them crossed the Channel. A number settled in and around Belfast. They brought with them the craft of fine linen weaving. Linen was not new in Ulster, but the arrivals lifted its quality to a level that would transform the economy of the whole region. In 1689, war came again. A Catholic king against a Protestant one, and Belfast was on the front line. On the 14th of June 1690, William of Orange himself landed just up the coast at the head of around 16,000 men. He rode into Belfast and stayed 5 days before marching south. 2 weeks later, he won the battle that decided the crown. The penal laws that followed shut Catholics out of property, profession and politics for 2 generations. Belfast was now a Protestant town in a Protestant province, and it was beginning to prosper. The population rose from around 2,000 in 1685 to around 8,000 by 1750. Trade grew in wool, hides, tobacco and sugar. The small river Farset was gradually covered over, becoming the main street. The linen trade organised itself around new commercial buildings. Belfast was overtaking its old rival on the Lough as the dominant port of Ulster. The town of the Sandbank Ford had become a merchant town. It did not yet know what it was about to become. In 1750, Belfast was still a small town, 8,000 people, a covered river, a linen trade growing quietly in the surrounding countryside. 50 years later, it would be one of the most politically dangerous towns in the British Isles. The reason was simple. Belfast had grown rich on linen, but it had almost no political voice. The town elected 2 members to Parliament, but they were chosen by 12 men. And those 12 men were all appointed by a single noble family. The Presbyterian merchants who ran the linen trade, who built the warehouses, who sent the ships out across the Atlantic, had no vote. In their own churches they already governed themselves through elected elders. In their own town they governed nothing. They read widely. They watched the American colonies declare independence in 1776, and many of them had relatives who had fought for it. They watched Paris rise in 1789 and saw the same principles being written into law. On the 14th of October 1791, a group of them gathered in a tavern off the main street. They were joined by a Protestant lawyer from Dublin who had just published a pamphlet arguing that Catholics and Protestants would never be free until they worked together. His name was Theobald Wolff By the end of the evening, they had founded the Society of United Irishmen. Their first resolution called for complete parliamentary reform and for the union of every Irishman, regardless of religion. The government moved against them. The society was declared illegal. Leaders were arrested. When the rebellion finally came, in the early summer of 1798, it was uncoordinated and outgunned. In the north, the rising was led almost entirely by Presbyterians. On the 7th of June, a local merchant named Henry Joy McCracken led an attack on the town of Antrim and was defeated. 6 days later, the Ulster rebels were crushed at a town south of Belfast. McCracken was hanged in the main street of his own city in front of a crowd that included his sister. Around 30,000 people died across Ireland in a single summer. The British government concluded that Ireland could no longer be governed from Dublin. In January 1801, the Irish Parliament was dissolved. Ireland was now governed directly from Westminster. The political class left Dublin. Belfast barely noticed. It had never had a parliament of its own to lose, and its merchants had new markets to chase. The first industry to transform the town was not linen, it was cotton. From the 1780s onwards, small cotton mills had opened along the rivers around Belfast, powered first by water, then by steam. By 1811, tens of thousands of people were employed in cotton spinning in and around the town. Rows of small brick houses went up on open fields west of the old centre to shelter the workers pouring in from the countryside. A town that had held 8,000 people in 1750 held over 25,000 by 1808. Then cotton collapsed. After 1824, with all tariffs removed between Ireland and Britain, the mills of Lancashire undercut Belfast on price and quality. One by one, the local cotton firms closed. On the 10th of June 1828, the largest of them, owned by the Mulholland family, burned to the ground. They rebuilt it for linen. Using a new wet spinning technique invented in England, the Mulhollands opened the York Street Mill in the spring of 1830. It was the first linen mill in Ulster to run entirely on steam. Within a decade, it held over 15,000 spindles and employed nearly 1,000 workers. Other cotton firms copied the conversion. The centuries-old cottage craft of linen, produced by women spinning at the hearth, was industrialised in a generation. The Great Famine struck Ireland in 1845. It killed around 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate. Belfast was spared the worst of it. Its economy was already based on industrial wages, not on the potato, and its port was the last sight of Ireland for thousands of emigrants passing through to Liverpool and New York. But the town was not untouched. In 1847, a single fever ship docked at the quay, and typhus cases in the town swelled to 14,000 that year. The poor of the western and eastern working districts died in numbers that were quietly forgotten afterwards. And the countryside came to Belfast. By 1851, the population had passed 100,000. In 1852, Belfast passed Dublin in tonnage and trade. For the first time since there had been a capital in Ireland, the largest port on the island was in the north. The transformation of the harbour was as dramatic as the mills. The River Lagan had always been too shallow for modern ships. In 1841, an Irish engineer named William Dargan cut a straight deep channel through the tidal flats and piled the dredged mud into an artificial island at the mouth of the river. They called it Queen's Island. 8 years later, a second cut opened the Victoria Channel. Ocean-going vessels could now reach the quays at any tide. On the new island, the first shipyards opened in the 1850s. In 1858, a young English engineer named Edward Harland bought a small failing yard on Queen's Island. 3 years later, on the 11th of April 1861, he formed a partnership with a Hamburg-born draftsman named Gustav Wolff. Their yard would eventually cover 80 acres and employ 10,000 men. But in 1861 it was 1.5 acres and 100 workers, launching iron ships for a handful of Liverpool shipping lines. Belfast did not yet know what it had just become. By 1870, Belfast was the linen capital of the world. The nickname attached itself. Over 70 mills operated in or near the town. The York Street Mill alone had grown to 25,000 spindles. Nearly 20,000 workers, most of them women, stood at machines that threw off more linen in a day than a village of handloom weavers could produce in a year. The damp climate, the inland rivers, the port, and above all the capital of 3 generations of merchants all came together in a single industrial miracle. But the miracle was built on division. The workers pouring into Belfast from the countryside brought the sectarian tensions of rural Ulster with them. They settled in separate streets, in separate neighbourhoods, drinking in separate public houses. The first major riots broke out in 1857, after Protestant preachers held open-air sermons in the town centre. In July 1864, riots raged for more than a week and had to be suppressed by field guns sent from Dublin. In 1872, tens of thousands of Catholics marched through the western suburbs and the city burned again. Every decade seemed to produce its own season of sectarian violence. Belfast was rich, industrial, and modern. It was also beginning to crack along lines that would, within another generation, tear the whole island apart. By the 1880s, Belfast was rich, industrial, divided, and about to become the centre of the greatest political crisis in the British Empire. The shipyard on Queen's Island had grown beyond anything the founders could have imagined. Harland and Wolff dominated the yard, 80 acres of cranes and slipways along the mouth of the Lagan. In 1870, it had built its first ocean liner for the White Star Line. By the turn of the century, the White Star and Harland and Wolff partnership was producing the largest ships in the world. The Titanic was laid down in 1909, launched on the 31st of May 1911, and fitted out at the Belfast docks over the following year. 100,000 people lined the banks of the Lagan to watch her go into the water. She was lost in the Atlantic on the 15th of April 1912, 11 months later. Around 1,500 people died with her. Belfast had built the most famous ship in history and the most famous wreck. The Titanic was launched into a city on the edge of civil war. Westminster was debating a third Home Rule Bill, which would give Ireland its own parliament in Dublin. Ulster's Protestants had spent 3 generations building an industrial economy tied to Britain. They refused. On the 28th of September 1912, at Belfast's new City Hall, a lawyer named Edward Carson signed a document called the Ulster Covenant with a silver pen, pledging to resist Home Rule by any means necessary. By the end of the day, nearly 250,000 men had signed it across Ulster, some in their own blood. Another 250,000 women signed a parallel declaration. 4 months later, in January 1913, the Ulster Volunteer Force was founded, 100,000 men under arms. Then came the First World War. Nationalists and Unionists both enlisted in huge numbers, and the constitutional crisis was frozen. At the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, the Ulster Division was cut down in a single morning. 5,000 Ulstermen dead or wounded on the first day. When the war ended, Ireland was not the country it had been. The Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916 and the War of Independence that followed made a united Ireland impossible. In 1921, the island was partitioned. 6 counties in the northeast kept their ties to Britain. Belfast became the capital of a new state called Northern Ireland, and the first parliament opened in the city in 1921. Within a decade, it would move to a grand new building on a hill east of the city called Stormont, a name that would come to mean the government itself. Northern Ireland in 1921 held about 1.5 million people. Roughly 2/3 were Protestant, 1/3 Catholic. The new state was governed by one party for the next 50 years, and it was governed entirely for the majority. Voting districts were drawn to guarantee unionist control even in Catholic majority towns. Public housing was allocated by councils that openly favoured one community. The best jobs at the shipyard, in the civil service and in the police went to Protestants. Catholics were not excluded by law, as they had been under the old penal code. They were excluded by practice. The industrial economy that had made Belfast also began to slip. Linen declined through the 1920s, hit first by synthetic fibres and then by the Great Depression. Shipbuilding held on longer, but the workforce of 35,000 at the Harland and Wolff yard in the 1930s would be a fraction of that by the end of the century. Unemployment in the working class districts was chronic. The poverty was shared across the sectarian divide, but the resentment was not. Then the war came to Belfast in the air. Over 4 nights in April and May 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed the city. The defences were minimal. On the night of the 15th of April alone, 200 bombers killed around 900 people. 100,000 were left homeless. Outside London, it was the deadliest single night of the Blitz anywhere in the United Kingdom. The shipyard was hit. So were the working class streets beside it. In neutral Dublin, the Irish Prime Minister ordered his own fire brigades north across the border to help, the first time since partition that the two Irelands had acted as one. The post-war decades were quieter, but the underlying structure did not change. By the 1960s, a new generation of Catholics, better educated and no longer willing to accept the arrangement, began to organise a civil rights movement modelled on the one in the American South. In October 1968, a march in Derry was broken up by police with batons, and the images went around the world. The old state was finished. What came next was something nobody had planned for. If this channel has ever brought a piece of history to life for you, consider joining as a member. It helps fund the research, the production, and the next reconstruction. The link is in the description. The Troubles started in the streets of Belfast and Derry in the summer of 1969. By August, British troops were on the streets of Belfast to separate rioting Catholic and Protestant neighbourhoods. The troops were at first welcomed by Catholics as protection. Within months, they were the enemy. What followed was a 30-year conflict that killed around 3,500 people on an island of 6 million, most of them in Belfast and its surrounding towns. Belfast was redrawn by the violence. Walls went up between Catholic and Protestant streets, some of them still standing today, officially called peace lines. The Falls Road and the Shankill Road ran parallel less than a mile apart and might as well have been two different countries. On the 21st of July 1972, a single afternoon known as Bloody Friday, the Provisional IRA set off more than 20 bombs across the city centre in 80 minutes. 9 people died. 130 were wounded. It was one of many such days. The political deadlock lasted a generation. Stormont was suspended in 1972, and Northern Ireland was ruled directly from London. Ceasefires came and collapsed, talks began and broke down, thousands more people died, before the machinery of peace finally caught up with the exhaustion of the fighters. On the 10th of April 1998, Good Friday, a deal was signed in Belfast that ended most of the violence. It was ratified by voters on both sides of the border in May. The IRA decommissioned its weapons over the following years. Stormont, restored in a new form, began again. Belfast today is a city that has not quite finished becoming itself. The shipyard is mostly silent, its giant cranes kept as monuments. The Titanic is remembered in a museum that draws visitors from around the world. The peace walls remain in several neighbourhoods, so do the murals, Unionist and Republican, layered over old brick. The old textile mills have become apartments and offices, and glass towers are going up along the river where the linen warehouses once stood. The ford in the mud, the Norman keep, the planted town, the radical town, the linen capital, the shipyard city, the divided state, the peace city, each layer still visible in the stones. Belfast did not begin as anyone's idea of a city, it became one anyway.